Okay, so wow, you guys sent in some really like foundational stuff for this deep dive. I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Aristotle, this is like the bedrock.
This is a bedrock, yeah.
If you want to understand Western thought, this is where you start. So we're gonna dive deep into Aristotle.
Yeah, and I think, for our listener, clearly a philosophical mind, we're going to go beyond just a simple overview. Like, we want to really unpack some of the most, critical, fascinating aspects of Aristotle's thought as presented in this, like, really comprehensive resource. It's really about understand why, even now, his ideas are so central to philosophical discussion.
Absolutely. And it's a lot, right? I mean, you think about the sheer volume of work, an estimated 200 treatises, 31 surviving, the range of topics, like from the intricacies of logic to like the grand sweep of metaphysics, ethics, biology, politics, even rhetoric, the art of rhetoric. It can be a little daunting.
Yeah, it can be a little daunting. I mean, one of the interesting things I find, as someone who's read Aristotle quite a bit, is that his influence is huge, but he's not the easiest guy to read. Like, he's
Yeah.
very dense, he's got all his own vocabulary, and the way his work comes down to us, it sometimes feels like he's giving advanced lecture notes as opposed to, really polished prose.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about, especially like in comparison to his teacher, Plato.
Yeah, right. Plato's dialogues, they're often kind of beautiful in a literary way, right? So they have a certain accessibility to them.
Yeah, there's this famous quote, I think it's from Cicero, where he compares um, Plato's prose to silver and Aristotle's prose to a river of gold. So
Oh,
there's this idea that like Plato's very clear and elegant and Aristotle is like rich and deep, but maybe not like immediately elegant.
okay. Yeah. Okay, so for the philosophical mind listening, we're not going to get bogged down in like a line by line kind of exegesis.
Right.
What we're going to do in this deep dive is really focus on like what are the fundamental commitments that kind of underpin Aristotle's whole system? What are the methods that he used, which like in and of themselves have had such a huge impact on like how we approach philosophical inquiry?
Yeah.
And then like what are some of those really kind of pivotal achievements that are highlighted in this, Stanford entry? So why don't we start with like the man himself, like where did he come from?
Okay, so Aristotle was born in 384 BCE
BCE.
in a place called Stagira. And at about 17, he went to Athens to join Plato's academy.
Hmm.
And he stayed there really as like a devoted student until Plato died in 347. So, 20 years, intense intellectual partnership, which clearly shaped his thinking, even though he would later kind of go off in his own direction in some ways. But after Plato died, Aristotle spent some time in Assos in Asia Minor and then on the island of Lesbos. And it was during this time that he really started doing like empirical investigations, especially in marine biology. He was very interested in sea creatures and stuff like that.
Mm. Interesting.
And then, while he was on Lesbos, he married a woman named Pythias.
Okay.
And then, in 343 BCE, he gets summoned by King Philip II of Macedon to tutor his son, who was 13 at the time, Alexander.
Yeah, Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great.
Oh, yeah.
So, what was Aristotle's influence on Alexander is kind of endlessly debated. But it's generally accepted that he was like a pretty important intellectual mentor to him for several years. So, yeah, this really fascinating kind of intersection of philosophy and political power right there.
Right. Okay.
Then we get to like 341 to 335 BCE. It's a little less well documented, but in 335 BCE, Aristotle goes back to Athens and he establishes his own school, the Lyceum.
The Lyceum.
Lyceum. And unlike the academy, which was really focused on, philosophy and mathematics, the Lyceum under Aristotle really engaged in a much broader range of like empirical research.
Huh. So botany.
Yeah, so they studied like botany, zoology, logic, music, political theory.
Wow.
It's an incredibly diverse set of fields that they were investigating.
I mean, it sounds like this intellectual powerhouse, right? Like this real center for like systematic inquiry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I also read that like they were avid collectors of manuscripts, basically building what's considered to be the first great library of antiquity.
You're right. So that was like vital for their studies,
Yeah.
having all this material to draw on.
Hmm.
But during this period, his wife, Pythias, passes away, and he enters into a relationship with a woman named Herpulus, who's also likely from Stagira. And they had a son, Nicomachus, to whom the Nicomachean ethics is attributed. But this period of, really intense activity in Athens, it wasn't going to last.
Yeah, it's coming to an end.
In 323 BCE, Alexander the Great dies,
Right.
and anti-Macedonian sentiment is just surging in Athens.
Right. Because of his connection, obviously, with the Macedonian court. Right.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
And so Aristotle was like, yeah, I should probably leave. And there's this famous quote attributed to him where he says, "I will not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy," which is obviously a reference back to
Yeah.
Socrates.
Right.
So he withdraws to a place called Chalkis on the island of Euboea, and he dies there of natural causes the following year in 322 BCE.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the context, right?
Yeah.
We have this life that's very much embedded in these huge intellectual and political currents of the time.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dig into like how he actually did philosophy, because the entry really emphasizes this idea of phenomena
Mhm.
and also the endoxic method.
Right. And this is really key, I think, for understanding Aristotle,
Mm.
especially compared to like some other influential approaches. Because unlike someone like, say, Descartes, who starts by radically doubting everything, like doubting the evidence of his senses, Aristotle has a much more fundamental trust in our perceptual faculties and in our cognitive faculties. He thinks that they do give us a reliable picture of the world, even though it's sometimes incomplete. And so his philosophical method is a lot like the way a careful natural scientist would approach like a phenomenon.
Okay, so no Cartesian foundational doubt here. So instead, he starts by examining like what he calls the phenomena, which is like the appearances, like how things present themselves to us. And then he incorporates endoxa, which are like the credible opinions, the views held by, respected thinkers on the matter.
Yeah, exactly. The phenomena are really just that it's like our immediate experience of the world, how the world shows up for us. And the endoxa are kind of the considered judgments of those who've already like thought carefully about these appearances, right?
Hmm.
So Aristotle saw philosophy as originating in wonder. Like it's this sense of being perplexed by how things appear to us, and those puzzles, those aporia, that's really what drives philosophical inquiry forward.
I mean, I always love the word aporia, like it literally means no way forward, right? Like you
Yeah.
hit this puzzle, this paradox. And the entry gives us a great example from, ethics, which is acrasia. Weakness of will. We all have this experience of sometimes like acting against our better judgment. And Aristotle argues that we need to, like, he says, set out the appearances,
Yeah.
basically acknowledge this lived reality and run through all the puzzles or
Right.
all the
Yeah.
problems that presents, and then examine the relevant endoxa. Like, what have thinkers said about this really puzzling phenomenon of acrasia? And the point isn't necessarily to just blindly accept whatever some, respected authority has said, especially when, like, a lot of times they'll contradict each other,
Right.
but it's to really work through them critically.
Yeah, I think one thing that's really insightful here for a philosopher is that it's not just about deferring to tradition.
Right.
It's that Aristotle sees that there's real value in endoxa
Yeah.
because often they'll encapsulate, accumulated wisdom, or they'll really highlight the genuine kind of difficulties and complexities within a problem. And so by engaging with these established viewpoints, we can do things like uncover problematic assumptions, we can identify inconsistencies, and maybe kind of forge a more nuanced path forward.
Right.
So it's really a dialectical process of refinement.
Right. And the entry gives another really helpful example with Aristotle's discussion of time in the physics.
Yeah.
So our everyday experience tells us that time passes. I mean, that's the phenomenon.
Right.
But when we actually try to pin down like what time is, we immediately run into a bunch of puzzles, the aporia.
Yeah.
And then Aristotle really meticulously surveys like what have, previous thinkers said about time? Like what are the endoxa on the nature of time? And he points out like all the contradictions and the conceptual difficulties they run into, like, do the past and the future actually exist? And what about the present moment? Like, what even is that? It seems to vanish as soon as we name it. And these aporia, then, they don't become roadblocks. They actually become the very starting points for his own really intricate analysis of time.
Exactly. And I think that's a really great insight into the Aristotelian method. The aporia, they're like these pressure points that really, really kind of hone the investigation. They make you like, face these really fundamental questions like, is time a substance? Is it relative to motion? Is it infinitely divisible?
Right.
So you have this method of, engaging with the empirical observations and also with the considered opinions of those who've come before you. And that's really characteristic of Aristotle's approach, whether he's doing, natural philosophy or ethics or anything.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about the methods. Now let's talk about some of the tools, right? For the philosopher listening, what are some of the instruments that Aristotle used in this process of inquiry? And that brings us to logic and science and dialect.
Right. And the first one, logic, this is really one of Aristotle's most monumental, most influential achievements, right?
Mm-hmm.
He develops the first systematic logic, the theory of the syllogism. And he sees logic not as a science in itself, not as, concerned with a particular domain of being, but really as a tool. Like it's an organon, it's an instrument that's applicable to all forms of reasoned inquiry,
Right.
whether it's scientific or dialectical.
So what's so fascinating here, I think, is that he is really trying to codify the very principles of valid inference, right? He starts with this notion of a perfect deduction,
Yeah.
which is this kind of self-evidently valid argument where the truth of the conclusion is just immediately apparent.
Yeah, like it's so clear that it just, you have to accept it, right? Like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal.
Right, exactly, exactly.
Or the classic example, all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. And so his idea, his project, was really to show how all other forms of valid deduction can ultimately be reduced to these perfect deductions through a set of transformation principles. So it's really like a quest to find the underlying structure of sound reasoning.
Right. And then he really sort of analyzes the fundamental components of reasoning in terms of inclusion and exclusion relations between, categories, right?
Yeah.
Like you could even visualize it with Venn diagrams if you want. And he comes up with these meta theorems, right? These fundamental rules.
Yeah.
That any valid deduction has to adhere to. Like, for example, you can't have two negative premises and then get a positive conclusion.
Right.
Or, if the conclusion is negative and one of the premises has to be negative. Stuff like that. And the fact that, Immanuel Kant, writing, over 2,000 years later, says, Aristotle's logic is basically complete.
Yeah.
All we need to do is make a few minor adjustments. That tells you something, right? About the impact.
It really does.
Yeah.
But Aristotle was also aware that logic, as powerful as it is, was really in the service of a larger purpose. And particularly this idea of episteme, which we often translate as science. But it has a more specific meaning for Aristotle.
Right.
For him, scientific knowledge isn't just about arriving at true conclusions through deduction.
Mm-hmm.
It requires premises that are not only true, but that are necessary and that actually reveal the underlying mind-independent nature of things.
Right. So it's not just about stating facts.
Yeah.
It's about illuminating the fundamental priority relations.
Yeah, it's like explaining the less well-known in terms of the more fundamental in terms of what's better understood.
Right.
And a classic example is, why do trees lose their leaves in autumn?
Right.
A superficial explanation might just say, oh, well, the weather's changing.
Right.
But a deeper, more genuinely scientific explanation, and this is something that, Aristotle obviously wouldn't have the full story on,
right,
but it would delve into the role of sunlight, chlorophyll, the process of photosynthesis.
Yeah.
So it's really about revealing these underlying causal mechanisms.
Right.
And so Aristotelian science aims to grasp the causal order, the invariant patterns in the natural world, and it relies on premises that have this kind of necessity to them.
Okay. And that brings us to demonstration or apodexis, which is this specific type of deduction, right?
So a demonstration for Aristotle is a syllogism where the premises not only are true, but they also reveal these fundamental causal structures.
Right.
So they're capturing what is necessary and what is better known by nature, which means more basic. But this raises a really critical epistemological question, I think, which would be very interesting to a philosopher. And that's, how do these chains of demonstration begin? If every piece of demonstrable knowledge relies on premises that are themselves better known and, potentially demonstrable, where's the starting point?
Yeah, exactly. Where does it all begin?
Yeah.
And, Aristotle really grapples with this. He rejects the idea that you could have an infinite regress or that it's some kind of circular reasoning. And his solution is this concept of know, which is often translated as intellect or intuitive reason.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this immediate kind of unmediated intellectual apprehension of first principles.
Yeah.
Right. So he outlines this process of moving from particular perceptions through memory and repeated experiences to the development of general concepts, and then finally to this intuitive grasp of fundamental truths, the indemonstrable starting points of scientific knowledge. And this, as the entry points out, this transition from the contingent realm of, sensory experience to the necessary realm of these first principles, this is a point that's been debated ever since.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Huge debate. Some people think, it's a little bit of an optimistic leap.
Right.
That it relies too much on this kind of intellectual intuition that maybe isn't sufficiently grounded.
Right.
But others argue that that's a misunderstanding of the relationship between like necessity and observation in Aristotle.
Right.
But alongside logic and this like very rigorous idea of scientific inquiry, you also have dialectic,
Right.
which for Aristotle is a crucial and distinct mode of reasoning,
No.
particularly in philosophy.
Right. So dialectic, I mean, as the entry says, it's this form of reasoning that proceeds from the endoxa,
Yeah.
from those widely accepted or reputable opinions that we were talking about earlier. And it's really useful in those situations where we haven't yet achieved like that kind of certain demonstrable knowledge that's characteristic of science. And Aristotle identifies a few important roles for dialectic.
Yeah, he lays out like three main purposes for it. First of all, it's a form of training, right? So it's honing your skills in argumentation, critical
Okay.
thinking. Secondly, it's a method for, engaging in reasoned conversation and debate. But thirdly, and I think most significantly, especially for the sciences of a philosophical sort, it's a way of critically examining the endoxa.
Right.
So by taking these credible opinions and really subjecting them to rigorous cross-examination, identifying inconsistencies, exploring their implications, you can actually use dialectic as like a tool for discovery.
Yeah.
And maybe even, get closer to first principles in those domains where like direct scientific demonstration isn't yet possible.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've explored Aristotle's like distinctive methods, I want to move on to some of the core philosophical commitments that really kind of shape his whole system. And the entry next highlights his really deep commitment to essentialism and also his kind of contrasting views on the nature of homonymy,
Right.
which are like these huge issues in metaphysics and the philosophy of language. So just starting with essentialism, right?
Yeah.
It's like in its most basic form, it's the idea that things have these like discoverable underlying necessary features that fundamentally define like what they are.
Yeah, exactly. And Aristotle, he has like a bunch of different Greek terms for this idea of essence.
Yeah.
But the one that he kind of settles on as his like technical term is tetianai, which literally means what it was to be. So it's about capturing like what is it to be, that kind of thing. And it's not just any like universal characteristic. It's a property that's explanatorily deep
Right.
and really, really kind of constitutive of a thing's identity.
Right, right. And it's fascinating how this differs from like what the entry calls modal essentialism,
Yeah.
which is this view that if an object were to lose its essential property, it would cease to exist altogether.
Right.
Right. Aristotle does talk about like properties that are necessary to a thing, meaning like it always possesses them,
Right.
but they're not part of its essence.
Yeah, and those he calls the idea or the propria.
Right.
Like, for example, the capacity for grammar in human beings. That's the necessary property. We all have it. It flows from our rationality, but it's not the core
Yeah.
of what it means to be human.
Right, right. So for Aristotle, it's not simply about what's invariably present. It's about what's like fundamentally explanatorily prior.
Yeah.
Right. And this is where his really famous critique of Plato comes in, particularly with the concept of univocity.
Right.
Yeah.
So Aristotle noticed that Plato often seemed to assume that if you use the same term to refer to different things, like, for example, the term good,
Right.
then it must have a single shared meaning. There must be like this univocal definition that captures the essence of goodness
Yeah.
in all of its instances. But Aristotle was like, no.
No.
There's this thing called multivocity or homonymy,
Right.
where things are called by the same name,
Right.
but the accounts, the definitions are different.
Totally different.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a classic example he gives is like bank, right?
Yeah.
It can be the bank of a river or a bank where you keep your money, and those have like nothing in common.
Yeah, pretty much nothing. But what's really philosophically interesting, I think, is when you have cases where there's like partial overlap or relatedness.
Right.
And the famous example, of course, is good,
Right.
because Aristotle is directly taking on Plato here.
Yeah.
And there's that famous quote where he says, Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth.
Yeah.
But his idea is that the term good doesn't have a single meaning when we say, like, Socrates is a good person, communism is a good political system, or this creme brulee is good.
Right. Right. So, I mean, he suggests this kind of like paraphrase test to help discern these cases of like non-univocity,
Yeah.
which is if you can't substitute the paraphrased meanings across these different uses without like a really significant change in sense, then it's it's probably multivocal,
Yeah.
right? So like Socrates is a virtuous person, that doesn't really work when you try to plug that into like communism is a just social system
Yeah.
or this creme brulee is a delicious dessert.
Yeah.
They're totally different.
And this really challenges like the whole Platonic idea that there's this single form of the good that everything participates in.
Right, right. Okay, so then he goes on to introduce this idea of core-dependent homonymy,
Yeah.
which is sometimes called focal meaning.
Yeah.
Right. And this is like his middle ground between like strict univocity, which is what Plato seemed to favor, and just mere accidental homonymy, where the shared term has like no connection at all.
Yeah, right. So with codependent homonymy, there's some kind of connection, but it's not like a single univocal meaning.
Yeah.
And his example is like the term healthy.
Okay.
So you could say like a person is healthy or a diet is healthy or even like a complexion is healthy.
Right.
And the specific meaning differs in each case.
Right.
But clearly the latter two depend on this core meaning of, being in a sound bodily state.
Right. Okay. So, and this idea of core-dependent homonymy becomes really crucial for understanding his view on being itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, he famously denies that there's, like, this one overarching genus of being that encompasses all things that exist.
Right.
But he does say there's a science of being qua being, or what later became known as metaphysics.
Right.
First philosophy. And this hinges on this idea that the verb to be and all its cognates, they're core-dependent homonyms.
Exactly.
So when we say Socrates exists, Socrates' location exists, and Socrates being morose exists,
Yeah.
the latter two senses of exists depend on the primary instance of being.
Right. Which is Socrates himself.
Right.
Yeah, it's the substance that is the primary instance of being.
Yeah.
And you can see this, like if you try these sentences out and you're like, Socrates exists, and then you say, like, Socrates weighing 73 kilos exists.
Yeah.
It just sounds a little weird, right?
Yeah,
It does.
it's a little awkward. Yeah.
And that shows you that those attributes, quantities, qualities, they all depend on the prior existence of the substance.
Right.
And so being becomes this, like, core-dependent homonym. And that allows you to have a science that studies beings precisely in their relation to this primary instance of being, which is substance.
Okay. So this kind of naturally leads into like the categories, right? The 10 categories.
Yes, the famous 10 categories. And as the entry points out, they're introduced kind of abruptly at the beginning of the categories.
Yeah, it's like, bam, here they are.
Yeah, right.
Substance, quantity, quality, relation, place, time, position, state, action, passion.
Yeah.
And it's presented as this like fundamental framework,
Yeah.
this basic structure for understanding like how we can talk about the things that are.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Aristotle doesn't really give you an explicit derivation of why he's chosen these.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't even really say like exactly what it is that they're supposed to be categorizing. But if you look at his examples and the way he uses them, I think it's pretty clear that he's aiming to classify like the most fundamental kinds of beings that exist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's below the level of like complex combinations or truth evaluable statements, like what the entry calls below the level of truth makers.
Right.
So like think about the statement, man runs,
Okay.
right? The fact is man running.
Right.
But the terms man and runs, they pick out entities that fall under different categories.
Right. Substance and action.
Yeah.
Right.
And so the categories are really about these basic building blocks of reality, the fundamental ways that we can predicate things of a subject.
Okay. And implicitly, I mean, it carries this presumption, right? That
Yeah.
these 10 categories are both exhaustive, like they cover everything.
Yeah.
And that they're irreducible, that you can't like boil them down to a smaller set.
And this has been, criticized obviously throughout history.
Yeah.
Kant, for example, thought that Aristotle just kind of stumbled upon these categories without giving any like real principled grounding.
Yeah.
But Aristotle seems to justify it by just how useful it is.
Right.
And how much explanatory power it has.
Right. And we've already seen that with like his analysis of time.
Yeah.
Right. Where he says it's the measure of motion with respect to the before and after.
Right.
Which puts it in the category of quantity.
Yeah, the quantity.
Right. And helps to explain like why it's dependent, why it's derivative.
Right.
And also with the core dependent homonymy of being.
Yeah.
right? Where the theory of categories really provides this framework for understanding like how non-substance categories are dependent on substance.
Yeah, and there's that famous quote where he says, if there were no primary substances, it would be impossible for anything else to exist.
Right. Okay. So this sets us up then for like his four causes.
Right, exactly. This really influential idea of the four causes.
The doctrine of the four
The
causes.
four causes: material, formal, efficient, and final.
And this is really about like how to explain why things are the way they are.
Yeah. And the entry really stresses that Aristotle is like very explicit about what makes an explanation a good explanation.
Right.
So he lays out his criteria.
Yeah.
And this is where the four causes come in.
Yeah.
So in Physics II, he's got this passage where he lays them all out. The material cause is the matter out of which something is made, like the bronze of a statue.
Right.
The formal cause is the form, the essence, the shape, the structure that makes it that kind of thing.
Right.
The efficient cause is the agent, the process that brought it into being. So the sculptor who makes the statue.
Mm-hmm.
And the final cause is the purpose or the end for which something exists.
Right.
So, for example, the statue might have been created to honor, a particular individual.
Right. And I mean the example of the statue is great for really seeing this, right? Because it's easy to grasp all four.
Yeah.
So, the bronze is the material cause.
Yeah.
The actual form of, say it's a statue of a president, right?
Okay.
That's the formal cause. The sculptor and their actions, that's the efficient cause. And the purpose of like honoring the president is the final cause.
Yeah.
And Aristotle famously claims that